Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Dakota, a YouTube channel that's designed to take a comprehensive look at the various facets of narcissism from different psychoanalytic perspectives. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. The title of today's video is, This is what happens when a narcissist returns home for a family visit, the unrelenting loop of despair. And I think if you haven't, this is part 2 by the way, if you haven't had an opportunity to look at part 1, now may be a good time to go back and check out that video. I think we can call the unrelenting loop of despair. I mentioned earlier that there are many different iterations of despair and many different things that happen when these individuals return home. But what we looked at in particular was a fellow who went home and was thinking and experiencing feelings of being judged. The unrelenting loop of despair, this is what I began to say a moment ago, is the cycle of projection and introjection. In part 1, just a very quick recap, we looked at the process of projection, which is a term that's commonly used amongst this population, and something that he admitted to himself. In this clinical example that I gave, this fellow returned home, and he returned home and he felt that his mother was judging him when she offered to help him. And I mentioned to the listeners to maybe fill us in for yourself, whatever's relevant to your experience or with your experience with people like this. But the mother offered to send him a job, or maybe set him up with a girlfriend, or send some social clubs that he can participate in, because he was complaining of feeling lonely and isolated, working below his means at his current job. Okay, so the projection, which he said was something that looked like, what he said is when his mother offered to help him, that he unloaded on her and accused her of thinking that he's a pathetic failure, that he's a loser. And he said, I know this is just something I'm probably projecting. Now, the projecting in this sense did not help. And I mentioned that there's a lot of research out there, social media content, that talks about how the narcissist projects. But understanding what that actually means and being able to use it, as compared to having just a cognitive, intellectual understanding, is very different. So if someone says, yes, I'm projecting, in a way it's like a throwaway comment. It doesn't really mean anything, especially if it doesn't help. But that's where we come in. If we have somebody like this in our life, that we feel close to, then we would help them. Because why do people project? People project, and what do they project? They project unwanted parts of themselves, parts that are intolerable. Okay? So in an earlier video, I think it was the Paranoid Narcissist, episode 3, I went into a lot of detail in terms of how to work with a projection and help the patient. And this is kind of where we left off in the last episode as well, is we want to help the individual begin to own his own, aspects of himself that he splits off and puts onto other people. So that's part of it. And when you can own that and get a little bit more comfortable with it, the world, as you can imagine, becomes a less dangerous place. Dangerous in the sense that you're always being judged, in this example that I gave. But what we didn't talk about, this is where we left off, and this is what I really want to hone in on in this video, is introjection. Now, in my social media content review, there was a lot of information out there about projection, but there's far less information about introjection. So I wanted to pay attention to this just for a little bit so that we can understand. See, because we always need more than one intervention or tool at our fingertips. And one way to help these individuals is if we take the route of projection and helping them with that. But another way is to think about how can we help with introjection. So what is introjection? And what does that have to do with projection? So let's picture this scenario. The projection is, this is a guy who was, again, working below his means, was over drinking and doing drugs and didn't feel too good about himself. In fact, you can imagine that maybe he even felt ashamed. But he cannot own that part of himself, so he puts it out into the world, that it was his mother who felt ashamed of him, right? She was humiliating him. He felt like she was saying that he is a pathetic loser. So in terms of now the way these two processes work together, in terms of introjection, we have to keep in mind the environment in which we live, in a way, is created. It's a fantasy. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but if we go back to the psychoanalytic theory, remember that's my bias, I'm a psychoanalyst. What I believe is that even though all of us have trouble, sort of judging reality, some of us really tend to distort reality quite a bit. And that's based on the nature of the projection. But what happens then is we tend to live in a reality that we are creating through projection. So like this fellow is walking around thinking his colleagues think he's stupid, his friends don't like him, his mother thinks he's a pathetic loser. What does he then begin to introject? So what he's taking in are hostile, yes, these are hostile, by the way, because this is they're judging and criticizing him. So it's a form of hostility. He takes this in, right? So then he takes this in and his world becomes populated with these really persecutory figures, right? Because this is the way he's imagining they see him. And since his world is populated persecutory, we call it in my field persecutory objects, because they're not whole, they're just sort of caricatures. And I say that because these people only focus on one aspect of the way they think somebody is looking at them. It's not the whole story. And I'll get into that a little bit more when we go back to the example with his mother. So let's just bookmark that. But what happens is, since they're taking this in and it's so uncomfortable, guess what they need to do? They need to project it. See, now this is the cycle that I was trying to get into in part 1 of this video series, is their world then becomes dangerous because they're projecting, but they live in this world where they constantly feel judged. You might remember this fellow had a hard time even leaving his apartment, or someone like this would have a hard time leaving their house, because as soon as they step outside, in their mind they're being judged and criticized and they're pathetic failures. And that's what's taken in. Now, by the way, just as an aside, if we think about this fellow, and this isn't uncommon for many people who are suffering with personality disorders, I mentioned that he was working below his means, that he has no hobbies, and that he doesn't really have any close friends, and he doesn't have any true intimacy. But all of these things get inhibited because of this process of projection and introjection. How? Because when we project, we're projecting parts of ourselves. So in other words, we're giving away big parts of ourselves, and then we become so consumed. He said, I'm obsessing about this. In fact, he said these were his words, was something like, I'm obsessing. I can't stop thinking that people see me as such a pathetic loser. In fact, that even began to spiral, because that led to, I can't even believe that I'm saying, because for the narcissist, the grandiose sense of self is what holds them together. And he's saying that I feel like a pathetic loser. And even just talking about this made him feel more like a loser. So I was saying that these inhibitions that they have, because of the projection and introjection, you can imagine that they become inhibited if they just walk outside, or if they join a social club, or they try to date. If these are the images, these are the thoughts and feelings that they have in their mind that they become obsessed with. One, what are they going to do if they're feeling judged and criticized? They don't have many options at their fingertips, so they may retaliate, like this fellow did with his mother, and attacked her and accused her of thinking he was a pathetic failure, or they may withdraw, right? And those are the inhibitions, because they withdraw, they retreat from society. And also, just as another side note, you can imagine that there's an incredible amount of energy that they use on this obsessive way of thinking, on the way that they present, on the way that they feel, on the way they feel other people are judging them. And if that much energy is being used in this obsessive way of thinking, there's not much energy left to pursue these other interests in life. Okay, so let's get right into how do we break this cycle. And again, I mentioned it in earlier videos, if we break it from the projection side, in terms of containing the projection, helping them own their feelings. And when I say containing, I mean within me, right? Because I'm the one who can then contain it and then detoxify it and then give it back to them in a way that's more digestible. But from the introjection side, this is a simple example of how we could begin to help them. Well, let me say this first. When he becomes convinced that his mother sees him as a pathetic failure, he has a capacity to say, I know this is not true, but that doesn't change the way that I feel about this. It's kind of like when he says, I project a useless side of myself onto other people. He can't really do anything with it. So what we have to begin to do, so one way to work with this, I just wanted to make this part clear, is when he projects and imagines other people are feeling a certain way about him, he is absolutely convinced that this is the way people feel. And that's something then that we can begin to question. But not after, and you know this if you've listened to any of my earlier videos or my podcast. First, of course, we always have to appreciate the subjectively useful component. You've heard me say this many times, but that's just understanding it from his perspective. But when we get very close to it, then we can begin to help him. We don't necessarily have to question it, but we need to help him begin to question his thoughts and feelings. And by the way, this is what we call turning something that's ego-syntonic into something that's ego-dystonic. Because people with narcissistic personality disorders, they don't question their reality. That's why it's called ego-syntonic. It's just, this is the way it is. Even though I know she's not really judging me, I believe that anyway. So we want to shake this up a little bit and try to make it a little bit more ego-dystonic. And here's a really simple example of how to work on that. And this is again from the side of introjection. So when somebody like this says, oh, my mother thinks I'm a pathetic failure, we can begin to say, how are you so sure of that? In other words, how do you know that that's what she's thinking? Or alternatively, we could say, is that all that she's thinking? Does she not have any other thoughts? Either way, either one of these ways may not be perfect, but I think you get the general point, is we want to begin to help him develop a more comprehensive way of thinking about the world. And one way to do that is by questioning, like, could your mother have any other motive in doing this? Was that her only motive? And slowly, if things go accordingly, we can begin to help him see that in so many situations, the interpretation is danger, that somebody's hurting, somebody's judging, somebody's criticizing, he's constantly under attack. And in so many situations, that's his default. That's like the way that he goes without really giving it any further thought. So now he thinks, well, what is that supposed to mean? What other motive would she have? And now if he says something like that, we can say, well, is it possible that this could also be perceived as a loving gesture? In other words, that she wanted to help. Yes, I can understand, by the way, as I mentioned in part 1 of this video, that it's a way to infantilize him. And that's what he was reacting to. And we're not going to take that away, but we're going to add something in. And that's really the important point, right? Is that we want to add in. We want to enrich his capacity to think about these things. Is it not possible that it was also not an act of love? But then we have to wonder, why would you leave that out? If he says, yes, I could see it this way, then say, how come you left that out? You see, because when it calls out love, it doesn't fit into that cycle of projection and introjection. But that's the cycle that we're trying to break. And this is one way to break it. In essence, what we're breaking is what also in my field we refer to as a sadomasochistic struggle. That's just a fancy word to describe the fights that he gets into. And many of these fights, you could say, are, internal in his mind. Even though they're internal, this is the stuff that still then populates his entire inner world, which then again needs to get projected. And that's why it's so important for us to help break this cycle of projection and introjection. And what I've tried to describe is just one way of doing this. Now, inevitably, I know this stuff is very complicated, and there are many other ways. Like again, if you go back to some of my earlier videos, I handled this, or I tackled this from the perspective of projection. And now I'm trying to tackle this from the other side of introjection, and just trying to get a sense of how we could break this up a little bit for them to loosen up that cycle of the projection introjection and help them develop a richer, more complicated, more loving inner world. Because when we have that, what we see then, when there's more love than hate, then there's less of a need to project. Anyway, I hope this is helpful. This was a quick one, and I know it's more complicated, but if you have any questions or anything if I said anything to confuse you, which inevitably I probably did, feel free to shoot me an email, reach out. I'd be happy to get back to you, or even do a further video on some of these really complicated matters. Like, for instance, I just snuck in sadomasochistic relationships. I snuck that in, and that's a whole nother conversation that we could have. But unfortunately, we have to stop. Maybe that's something we could discuss next time. Okay, until then, bye for now.